Hello everybody and welcome back into Cult Film Cafe with me, one of your hosts, Jonathan, and I'm joined as always with my partner in crime, Kenzie McLean.
Hello there.
And we have a new guest on the podcast. For this episode, we have Alistair Stewart.
Hello, Jonathan. Hello, Kenzie. Thanks very much for having me on. I'll just say at this point, I absolutely love this podcast. I've listened to every episode so far, so it's an absolute pleasure to be on with you.
Thanks for the glowing review, Ali. That means a lot to us here at the podcast. So, as everybody should be familiar with now, we are exploring 100 must-see cult movies poster, where on each episode, the guest on the episode picks a film from the poster and we break it down from different aspects, which will become more familiar as you listen to the podcast. So, as I've said, the guest gets to choose. So, Ali, what film did you pick from the poster?
So today we are going to be watching Apocalypse Now.
This is the end.
22 years ago this summer, Francis Ford Coppola created a groundbreaking masterpiece. This summer, he's taking you further with an entirely new version featuring a wealth of footage that's never been seen before.
Everyone gets everything he wants. I wanted a mission, and for my sins, they gave me one.
Your mission is to proceed up the Nung River, pick up Colonel Kurtz's path at New Mung Ba, and terminate the Colonel's command.
Terminate with extreme prejudice.
You can get any place up that river that suits you, young captain. If I say it's safe to surf this beach, Captain, it's safe to surf this beach. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It smells like victory.
We're going upriver about 75 clicks.
That's Cambodia, Captain.
Incoming! Just get us upriver. Who's the commanding officer here?
Ain't you?
Marlon Brando, Robert Duvall, Martin Sheen, Lawrence Fishburne, Dennis Hopper, and Harrison Ford. You may have been up the river, but you've never seen this.
I'm a soldier. You're an errand boy. Sent by grocery clerks.
So, first question, as always, is why that film out of the so many to choose from?
So why Apocalypse Now? About 15 years ago, Channel 4 did a list of 100 greatest war films of all time. Apocalypse Now came out at number 2. I'd never seen it, decided to watch it, and didn't really rate it. When I saw this list come out, I had a look at it, saw Apocalypse Now, and thought it was a great chance to revisit it as an older person with a bit more experience and see what I thought. That's the reason why I chose it now.
That's fair. I'm not familiar with that top 100 list. Maybe I should check that out myself. But I wouldn't say I'm a huge war film fan. It seems as though, for me though, that the war films I do like seem to be set in the backdrop of the Vietnam War. I think they're the ones that I find most engrossing, and it might just be because location or just that war was well documented for what it was at the time. Or I think even as young people, you're even familiar with it so much, because I think it's been spoke about over and over again in various different media forms.
So cards on the table, I'm a massive war film junkie, always have been. And I think you're right about Vietnam, and I think one of the reasons is the actual role of America within it, because it was such an era of political and cultural change, and also because America didn't actually win the war. They were hounded out of the country. It takes on an extra focus. A lot of people think, what was the actual point of war? Something like the Second World War, you could see a real point to that. Vietnam was different, and that's why a lot of people question it, and that's why a lot of good films have come out of Vietnam, and I would agree with you on that.
So, Kenzie, what about yourself? Am I right in saying that this is a film that your dad probably loves, I'm guessing?
Yes. My dad does like his war films, and this is one that he does really like. It's not his favourite, but I don't even know what his favourite actually would be, but he's a one that he really likes. He's got it on DVD. He's always talked about it being a great film. So yeah, I had never seen it, which is odd. Usually films like these I eventually see quite early, but I haven't seen this one, so it's good to finally watch it now.
So what about your initial thoughts on it? Just
well, I didn't know what I was going to think of it. Like I said, I'm not that into war films. I don't even know if I actually said that, but I'm not a big fan of war films. There's some I do like. The standout one for me is Full Metal Jacket. That I do really like that film, but for the most part, I'm not that big. So I was like, maybe I'll like it, maybe I won't. But overall, I liked it. I did actually like the film. I enjoyed it. I got the point of it. I enjoyed it. I watched the longest version. Probably shouldn't have. It was quite long, but overall I did enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, I think just want to preface this that I'm a big fan of this film, but I just want to say that the theatrical cut of this movie is far superior in my opinion, and probably purely from a pacing standpoint. I've watched two versions of this film, and when it gets to the longer versions, they drag on at points where it doesn't really need to. There's even silly scenes, like at the start when he goes to get his mission. That dinner scene in the final cut lasts longer than it does. In the original cut, it was like, they're going to have something. It was cut, that was him, he was on a boat and he was going. There wasn't any, let's sit around and talk. And so that's what I like about the theatrical version. It's still a super long film at nearly 2.5 hours long. But compared to any other version of this film, it's paced so much better. I don't know about your thoughts on it, Ali.
So I think it's a beautiful looking film. It's absolutely stunning. The cinematography in it is, it's still up there with some of the films that are released today. And a lot of the other technical aspects as well, like the sound editing, the way that they mix in music and just other sounds, even the use of the narration in the film is really good. For me, though, I think the film, it's not as good as the sum of its parts. The first two acts are pretty good, and I've got a lot of good things to say about the first couple of acts. I think the final act really lets the film down. It becomes too weird, too unrealistic. And also the acting in it, which is generally fantastic. Martin Sheen is brilliant in it. You come to the bit with Marlon Brando, and it is the most disappointing acting I think I've ever seen. If you look at what some actors do for parts these days, the amount of work that they put in, the amount of time to change their bodies, to hone themselves, and the fact that Marlon Brando couldn't be bothered to get into shape, and they had to actually edit parts of the film just to make him look believable, I thought that was really, really poor on Marlon Brando's part. I would recast it personally.
I mean, that's a tough one. I think there's a lot of, because of who made the film, Francis Ford Coppola. I think that's maybe why you look at the. This is a weird film as well, because the first two names billed in the cast list are two of the smallest parts in the movie. If you look at the theatrical cut, Robert Duvall's character's in the theatrical version for 11 minutes, and he's the second billed actor on the bill. Marlon Brando must be in the film for, what, if you add all these scenes together, maybe the same amount of time, and he's like the lead star. I can get that. I really like Marlon Brando, and I get what you're saying. I don't know. I think this has been over exaggerated, just how much that he's gained weight though. Like I remember thinking him being so much bigger than he actually was when I watched it this time around. He just looks like an older gentleman that's kind of got a bit heavier. It's not like he's 20 stone. Do you know what I mean?
You're right. I think a lot of that was the way they filmed it, but I think part of my problem with it was the whole film had built up to you seeing this, godlike character, and they'd almost built the film up too much, so that when you actually saw him and when you were face to face with him, I think regardless of who it was going to be a disappointment. And I think they could have maybe got around that by potentially bringing him in terms of, I don't know, some sort of flash forward or flashback sequence earlier in the film, so that you had realistic expectations, because by the time you actually meet him, whoever it is, it was going to be a disappointment.
Yeah, I kind of agree with your point, and I will sort of give you that the first 2/3 of this movie is amazing. I would say that the third act of the film is lackluster for a lot of different points. It kind of does become this kind of weird satanical, culty kind of mad film where he's the messiah, and which I don't quite understand, because he was an American soldier who went there to kill these people, but then all of a sudden he's leading the people. How does that work?
So the people that he's leading are I think it's the Montagues they're called, which is a certain indigenous part of the population of Vietnam who weren't actually affiliated with the North Vietnamese. But what they don't actually explain is what happened to the rest of his unit. So he's a lieutenant colonel. He'll have been in charge of about 400 or 500 soldiers. And the film doesn't actually explain, where they went, or whether he just went off on his own and went rogue. That's sort of left a bit uncertain.
Yeah, Kenzie, what's your thoughts? Do you agree that the last part of the film is a bit sort of strange and heavy-handed?
It caught me off guard. Like, I just didn't expect it. It kind of started, and then I was like, "Where is this going? What's happening? What's the point exactly?" I still liked it, but it was. I just didn't see where the film was going. I just didn't understand what it was going for, and by the end of the film, I am like, "What?" I don't. So what? Did he want him to kill him, or what? What the fuck? Like, and then they just leave, and it's like, okay, and then the film ends like straight away. It's like, oh, it's over. And it's like, wow, okay, all that just for that. It didn't. Well, it's not. There's no payoff really, but maybe it's not the type of film that's meant to have a payoff. But yeah.
So, sorry, Kenzie, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's all right.
Francis Ford Coppola's wife, Eleanor, she actually kept a journal of when he was making this, and she's written this down in the journal, which is supposed to be his thoughts. Now, you can take this with a pinch of salt as to whether this was actually said, but apparently he's supposed to have quoted, "My greatest fear I've had for months. The movie is a mess of continuity of style, and most important, the ending neither works on an audience or a philosophical level. Brando is a disappointment to audience. The film reaches its highest level during the fucking helicopter battle." And I've sort of got to agree with that the first couple of acts, really good, lots of, there are some good action scenes, there's a lot of good dialogue, there's some sort of moral dilemmas, the part where they go and, they shoot up the boat of the natives in it, and then it gets to the final act, and for me that just spoils the whole rest of the film. The film almost collapses in on itself.
I mean, yeah, what you were saying about the way he viewed the film, that is true. I don't know those quotes, but I've watched some YouTube videos about the sort of making of it, and his wife was actually. This is one of the things. In fact, do you know what it was? I was watching GQ's. He done the GQ YouTube, and you maybe get people on there like on my most iconic films. It was him. And he was explaining that when he does these big, long films, he likes to take his kids with him and his wife with him and stuff like that, just because he wants to be around his family all the time. But his wife was actually a really good sort of camera operator. She worked as a camera op on this film. And apparently they had a conversation, about him explaining how he would give himself or this movie an F, and how he felt about it. And she was like, wait a minute. And then they actually recorded it and they played the recording. And I agree with that. I don't think he actually enjoyed this one bit at all. I think this film was a disaster from day one, essentially. And there's lots of reasons around it. Francis Ford Coppola was only meant to be a producer in this film. This was actually meant to be directed by George Lucas, who dropped out of the project to then go on and make Star Wars. This film was meant to come out in like 1976, I think. But the production process went from 5 months to over a year. The production budget grew from 12 million to 31 million. Martin Sheen had a heart attack. It was just, this production was just fraught with disaster from day one. I think there was a lot of things about the way that the Americans thought that they were going to come across in it, and they totally sort of didn't help at all when they were in and around that area. It's just, I just read loads of little things and I'm like, what? I love the fact that he's still powered through and essentially has made a film that looks spectacular still to this day. With its flaws, I agree, it does have flaws. It's not a flawless film. But a lesser person would have just maybe walked away from this project.
And I think it's definitely testament to it that he kept up with it. I think one of the issues with this film, looking at Vietnam, is you mentioned when it was supposed to be released, 1976. I think it was 1979 when it finally got released.
Finally came out in 1979.
1979. Now, a lot of times when you do war films, you just need, or to do with any history, you just need a bit of historical perspective. You know, the US only withdrew from Vietnam in the mid-70s.
1975.
75. You know, that's not really long enough to have come out and had a proper perspective on it. However, what I would say is the film isn't necessarily about the Vietnam conflict. It's more about the conflict within man and the conflict of power. And to be honest, it could have been set in any conflict. They could have done the same film in Korea. So it's not necessarily about the Vietnam War itself. It's more about the conflict that rages within.
Yeah, it's one of those. It's funny. I think it's set as a backdrop, and I think it was maybe done that way to invoke some form of emotion in the audience for whatever reason. Because by my understanding, the film's actually sort of loosely based on a 1899 novella called Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. So obviously there was, where they were getting inspiration from had already been written, and they basically, all they'd done is changed that from the Congo to Vietnam. And that's maybe, yeah, you're very right. This could have been done anywhere. Like, it didn't have to be the Vietnam War. It could have been the Korean War. It could have been any war. It could have been. I think our war works just because of the way that the war zones look in a story like this. But I understand why he didn't like it, and I can understand why he probably viewed it at the time as a disaster. I mean, another thing that I read was he shot over 1 million feet of film for this film. And just to give that context, normally a fully edited 2-hour movie is 11,000 feet. So it just goes to show you how much footage he actually shot. And I think that's maybe why these cuts are a bit messy sometimes, because, I mean, if you've got that much footage, how do you make a coherent film? It must be a real struggle, like, on that side of things. I mean, we don't shoot in film, obviously, everything's digital, and I try and make things as tight as possible whenever I do a project. Me and Kenzie have worked together a couple of times, and as much as I've shot maybe 20 minutes and I've made a 10-minute film, that's nowhere near what he was contending with in terms of, I mean, if you shoot for over a year, you're going to have so much to try and sift through, to try and work out a logical narrative that makes sense to the audience.
Do you think he was trying to do too much?
Probably.
He was trying to make
a
beautiful looking film, a beautiful sounding film, make very points about the nature of man, also tell a story about, America in the war. It was almost just trying to achieve far too much.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about the GQ interview that I listened to, or him breaking down his best iconic films, that's what he spoke about. Is like he always just wanted to do a sort of project that would challenge him. So when he done The Godfather, I mean, he's not, the thing about Francis Ford Coppola is he's always seems to be around some form of production dispute, because The Godfather, I mean, it's got a mini-series made on just the making of it from a production standpoint on Paramount Plus. Just shows to go how convoluted productions can be. But unlike, I mean, The Godfather is a beautiful film still, and an amazing film. And the thing about Marlon Brando in that is that was an amazing performance in my opinion. So he obviously was like, he's capable of dialing in a performance. And that was off the back of Marlon Brando fading in Hollywood. Nobody really wanted to touch him because nobody wanted to watch his films. But then all of a sudden he comes back, does an amazing performance in The Godfather. And I think, and what Coppola has came out and said is he didn't want to do Godfather 2. He wanted to move on to different styles of films. And I think this is a logical progression in his mind. And I also think that he just wanted to produce and work alongside George Lucas, because they've got a good relationship with each other, and I think that they maybe had the same vision in terms of stuff, but I don't necessarily think he was wanting to helm a project like this. And maybe if you had George Lucas and Coppola throughout the whole production, they could have sort of shouldered the workload each, but so when one drops out, it's like all of a sudden he's got to step in and sort of do everything, and that could take a toll. And maybe that's how that's came across, is like, I think at the time he probably thought it was a great idea, but would he do it again? Probably not. I mean, if we could redo it, would they do it again? Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. We got, Kenzie, you got much to, so what about the film stands out to you? Like that, I think that's, so Ali's spoke about a lot of the technical things which you can't fault in the film. And I suppose that his one negatives is necessarily probably the story element, which is for a lot of people is what drives people to watch films. But it really, you have to be a certain kind of film watcher just to watch a movie that might not have a great story to try and find other elements in it. But Kenzie, how did you feel about just the story in general?
It's like, I don't think there's that much to the story. I guess there isn't really. I guess that's also not really the point of the film. Like, it's got the plot's kind of simple. It just takes a long time to get there. Really, it's not really about what the exact plot of the film is. It's more the journey getting to the plot. The plot of the film doesn't really kick in until the very last part, and that's like the weirdest part. Because really, it's just the journey to get to this colonel. And yeah, it's really like the whole point of the film is the journey to it, and it's long, but I think it's meant to be long. I watched a particularly longer version, which is even longer, maybe too long, was a bit sluggish, but I feel like that's the kind of point. The point is to kind of journey through the film. By the end of this film, I think you're meant to feel exhausted, because that's how the soldiers seem to be felt as well, and this somewhat disorientated and like not even really sure what's happening. Because it seems to be like a lot of the characters in the film seem to be the same. So although I would say the kind of the plot there wasn't much to it, it still works. Especially, of course, being carried by the cinematography and everything else in the film, this made it much better to sit through. One thing I was surprised about is how little action there was in the film. I was kind of not expecting there to be that little, so that was interesting. And of course, there's the big kind of helicopter part at the start, which is, I think that's kind of weird. I think since the film kind of like not like far into it, you already get this big helicopter part. You're like, whoa, what the fuck's happening? And then the rest of the film's there's not much. It's mainly just them on the boat and like kind of little things there and again, but it's not really that much. And most of the kind of little action things that are happening, you don't really see any of it. You can't tell what's happening really. I don't think anyone else could really tell what's happening. I think maybe that's maybe that was the kind of point. A lot of the things like if they're getting shot at, it's like night or like you don't even see where it's coming from. So yeah, it's overall I really feel like the film is just a journey. It kind of puts you in almost in the shoes of him a little bit.
I think that's a really good point, Kenzie, and what you said, especially about the disorientation. And one of my favourite scenes in the film is actually when they go up and they're trying to find some fuel, and apparently it's like the last army outpost before you get past before you go up the river into Cambodia, and it looks beautiful. You've got all the flares going off, but it's shot and it's deliberately dark. There's loads of noises going off, and the whole scene, it's quite difficult to watch because you really do feel disorientated, confused, and there's that element of the real lack of leadership. So you're absolutely right that it does put you in that position of you are confused, you are disorientated, and that's what war does. I think where my issue with it comes is it sort of overplays its hand about the lack of leadership. And what I wonder is, in this film, if they actually had anyone that had actually been to war and actually knew what it was like from different perspectives, and they could sort of put that spin on it. Because although a lot of the scenes are great, they're so unrealistic. Now, I know it's not supposed to be the most realistic film, and it's not supposed to tell a story necessarily about how Vietnam was, but just parts of it, they're so bad. When they go surfing in the water, although that looks really cool, it just never happened. And likewise, when the complete and utter absence of command, again, to that extent, it wouldn't happen. There is obviously failures of command and failures of leadership, but to the extent it's portrayed, I think it just overplays its hand a bit.
Yeah, I feel like I see that.
Yeah, I think like the scene you're talking about, that it does become very apparent because Martin Sheen's character, he goes up onto the bridge and he asks somebody who's in command, and the guy turns around and goes, "Isn't it you?" As if to say, I'm like, well, he's just how can he be? It's how can he be in command? He's just turned up. I get that, and I know what Ali's saying. It's too far to the extreme for it to be even close to accurate. I get in a war zone that, wars are very strategic for a reason. And there's got to be people from the top down commanding people. So I understand that, but it does give the audience that sort of sense of confusion and sort of disorientation of it. But yeah, there is a lot of... I think what Ali said at the start sums this up perfectly. Like the movie is a sum of its parts. I think there's parts of this film which will go down in history as some of the best things ever done. There's also parts of this film that people couldn't get on board with and are going to have a big issue with it. I just wanted to point out a couple of funny things. Like we were talking about the acting. I love most of the acting in this. I get your point about Brando. I think he was built up to be something that he turned out he wasn't. I always found it weird watching this film for the first time that Dennis Hopper's just randomly in the film when you get to the end as the photojournalist. But Martin Sheen's a funny one because he wasn't the original cast. He wasn't originally casted to play this role. It was Harvey Keitel.
He got fired.
He got fired. But I'm glad he did because I think Martin Sheen in this is probably perfect. Robert Duvall, I do like Robert Duvall, although he's only held on the screen for a few minutes, but he's got a presence on screen, which is something. The thing about his character, they built him up to be this guy, and he was the guy that you assumed him to be when you seen him. I think that's what they got right and what they got wrong with Marlon Brando's character. If they'd done the same setup and it was the same, it would maybe have worked out a bit better. And obviously you get a young Lawrence Fishburne. I quite like seeing Lawrence Fishburne in this film. But yeah, like the acting across the board is relatively good, and there's some really good parts. And like we were saying, cinematography spectacular, direction spectacular. I think Coppola done a good job. Production obviously great. I think the film was written probably very well. It's one that would seem quite a difficult production. I've got some gripes with the editing choices. I say this all the time with these kind of movies, as I don't necessarily think that some of the transitions that they use would be used today. See the kind of fade out stuff. I'm not a big fan of that, where it kind of you're fading out of one scene into another. It works at the start when Martin Sheen's character's kind of going mental and it's right disorientating. But some of the other choices like that, I'm not a big fan of. But I just want to lastly touch on the music. This film sort of merged pop culture music, so obviously things like the Doors and the Rolling Stones, with a fantastic score, which was obviously it was written by Francis Ford Coppola's father. But yeah, I think the music in this film is incredible. I don't know how you feel about it.
Yeah, and also the most famous bit of music is Wagner for the start of the helicopter scenes, where they have, the loudspeakers belting out this operatic version, and that is, it's really cool, and it's really cool to watch, but at the same time, it sometimes get criticised for being a bit too pro violence and a bit too pro gung ho. And it sort of treats the North Vietnamese with a bit of a sort of lack of respect. Although I understand why he's doing that. That's not the message he's trying to give, but some people have interpreted it like that.
Yeah. Anything else you want to touch on quickly? No? Is that us? Move on to the ratings from each of us.
Yeah, let's go on to the ratings, I think.
Right, cool. So as you are familiar with the podcast, if you are, we rate films out of 5 popcorn buckets. So, yeah, I'm going to go last because I'm probably the person that loves this film the most. I'll let Ali go first because I'm really interested to see what he gives it, because it depends what sort of viewpoint. He might look at it and go visually spectacular and go one way, or he might go his own opinion and go, no, this is what I'm giving it. So it'll be interesting.
So I've been giving this a lot of thought over the past couple of weeks. It's a bit sad, but that's what I've been doing anyway. And I was originally going to go for 2.5 popcorn buckets, just because I thought the third act detracted from the film so much. But just having had a proper chat through this and taken on the points that both of you said, and there is actually so much that is good about this film, and I think you can't ignore that. So I'm actually going to go for 3 popcorn buckets for this film.
Yeah, it's probably fair for you personally. So Kenzie, what about you?
I'm actually probably about the same. I was between kind of 3 or a 3.5, and I'm probably going to go with a 3. But I could go up. I clearly watched the wrong version of the film. I should have watched the one that everyone deems is the best, which is the theatrical version, or even the final cut, because some people really like the final cut, but it's still deemed to be the theatrical one that is the best. I apparently have watched the worst, so I really should watch the ones with better pacing, and I think that might actually will boost it up. So at the moment, I will give it a 3. Overall, I did enjoy the film. Still wasn't really my type of film, but it was different from what I expected. Enjoyed it. Overall, was happy with it. It was a bit long, but I got through it, and yeah, it was a journey.
Fair, both Ali and Kenji are a 3. Ali's here in the studio with me, and I'm shaking my head at those ratings. That's me personally. For those of you who have listened to the Godfather episode, I gave the Godfather 5 out of 5 because it's one of those films for me. I'm really this is close. I don't think that I can get there with this film, but I love this film. I think it's maybe because the sum of parts which are good is what I like in this film, and they're that good, and even 40 plus years later they're still that amazing that even the flaws in it, I still love this film so much. I'm going to give it 4.5 out of 5 for me.
And that's in consensus with what a lot of critics say. I realise that my take on this film is completely out of sync with the majority, not all, but the majority of critics. So that's you're quite up there, Johnny, with what the film critics say.
it's not even because I've looked at it and I'm being pressured into it. I genuinely love this film. It's a film that from the first time I watched it, I've always been a big fan. It's just, yeah, I know that people have got their opinions and stuff like that, and that's totally fine. And I don't necessarily want to say that I'm just jumping on the bandwagon, because I'm not. I mean, but yeah, it's one of those films, and like, I'm not a big war film person, and although we might argue this isn't actually a war film, but this is one of my favourites, like I said, and a lot of the ones that I like are Vietnam War films, so yeah, that's maybe why I've kind of got a bias towards such a high rating for me. But yeah, well, there you have it. That's the reviews done with. So we're now going to move on to Act 2 of the podcast, which is the rules of Cult Film Cafe. And if you're not familiar with them, they are low budget stroke box office flop, rewatchability, quotability, not well received by contemporary critics and reviewers, explores controversial topics, subjects and themes, and the cultural impact and legacy of the film. So yeah, we'll just open it up with the first one. Low budget stroke box office flop. Now, that's a no. Well, I'm just going to say no, we'll talk about it quick for a wee bit. Like we sort of touched on earlier, the film's initial production budget at the time when the film was sort of going into production was around $12 million, but quickly sort of swelled due to complications of the production to a closing budget of $31 million, which, if you want to put it in perspective, is around $120 million today. So it's a big budget.
Very big. But it made a lot of money.
Yeah, that done quite well. Like, I think it's one of those films that might surprise people. But I think when you look at how much it's made now, you've got to remember that's since day one. And this film's been re-released at least 3 or 4 times. 'Cause I think what happened, this is a funny one, when Full Metal Jacket and Platoon came out, they re-released this film because there was like a Vietnam War kind of buzz coming back. Don't know how well it done really, but it just shows you that it's like, and there's various records you can see if you do a bit of research, that there's been re-releases of the film over the years. Like when they done the Redux version in 2001, it would have probably had a theatrical run. I think that done about $12.5 million, just that version. And then you've got the final cut, which came out a couple of years ago, which would have been re-released. It was the 40th anniversary year of the film. So yeah, it was very successful. So it grossed around $100 million, which in today's money is about $400 million. And when I was doing my research, it was also very successful in terms of home media. I mean, it's easily sold $10 million plus worth of sort of VHS and DVD sales. I don't know the exact figure, but I know that, I mean, it's sold a lot in the sort of home media market as well.
I mean, yeah, and plus it's got like multiple versions of it released, so yeah, it's probably made tons.
Is anything else to add to the budget or stuff, or do you just want to?
I don't think there's much you can disagree with.
That's
the
it.
facts speak for themselves.
Well, so that's a no from that one. So rewatchability, we're on to, and that's kind of the contentious one, because we say at the podcast that 90 minutes is normally sort of prime rewatchability sort of length of films. But yeah, the theatrical cut of this film is 147 minutes. The Redux version of this film is 202 minutes. The bootleg first assembly cut is 289 minutes, and the final cut is 181 minutes. This is a long film. Like, so as much as I would deem it rewatchable for me personally, because I love the film, I know that it probably isn't for a lot of people.
I think it's a really tough rewatch. You know, it's just the pacing of the film. I think individual scenes, and we've got a lot of culture these days where film clips get, you know, chopped up and you can watch individual scenes, and I think there's certainly scenes that you could rewatch, but as a whole for the film, it's quite a daunting, tough prospect. You really have to be in a particular mood to put yourself through this again.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, I watched the longest version, and I don't think I'll ever watch that version ever again. But I still want to give it another rewatch, but I don't know if I want to do that straight away. Like, watching through that film, like, I looked at the clock multiple times. When a film's got me checking, like, the time that much, that's not good. But I'm like, Jesus, it's still got this much to go. I never do that with films, but when a film's got me doing it, the last two films I've watched have made me do that. That's not good. That means I'm wanting it to finish. So yeah, it's I need to watch the shorter ones, but they're still long. Yeah, it's what I don't. It must be rewatchable to some people, because like it's probably some people's like favorite war films and stuff like that. Like that list that you talked about, it was what, like number 2. It was as in the like top 100 best war films. So yeah, clearly it's rewatchable to a lot of people, but when you think of rewatchability films, this is not a film you think of. It's just too long.
Yeah, I think you say it might be a struggle for most people even to get through the film, but in terms of rewatchability, I'm happy to concede. I mean, like I said, although I personally love the film, and I could rewatch this film, and I would, if I stumbled on it on a channel, if I just flicked it on the telly, I would also stay and finish it. It's just one of those films for me. But I totally understand that, along with the length and potentially even the subject matter and stuff like that, probably isn't for everybody. But I just want to preface that I would only say that the theatrical cut is rewatchable to me because of the pacing. Any other one I probably wouldn't, just because it's way too convoluted in terms of length, and it's just got things in it that don't really need to be there. But I mean, I understand why filmmakers go back and sort of try and make the best possible version over and over again. But I mean, sometimes the choices you make at the start are the best, and I think the case is this film is, think the choices that you made to leave things out were the right choice all along. You didn't have to go back and revisit it. So yeah, but I'm happy to concede that it's not a rewatchable film, like the guys have said, and they've argued their points. And like I said, I'm more than happy to concede in that point. So, but we move on to quotability. It's one of these films where it's probably not got as many standout one-liners as some of the films on the list, but I do like a lot of the sort of back and forth in the dialogue. I think this film's a superbly written film as well. But my one, the big one for me is I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It's probably the biggest takeaway from the film.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It smells like victory.
Sometimes films have only got one or two. I don't know about yous, if yous have got anything else that would stand out for this in terms of quotes or lines of dialogue for the film.
Well, I mean, that one you mentioned is absolutely iconic. You know, it's one of the most famous lines in history. The other one that I picked up was at the end when Marlon Brando says, "The horror, the horror." That's another quite sort of key line that usually gets brought up. That's
another one that was written down by me. That's a weird one, that end scene as well. Like, it's, I don't know. Maybe I should just rewatch the ending over and over and force myself to hate this film. But the more I think about the end of the film, it is a bit weird.
Yeah, I don't really know where they were going with it. It's very odd. But for quotability, another good one is Charlie Don't Surf.
Kilgore again. What is it with the surfing in this film? That's what another realisation.
Yeah,
like you said,
no
that
idea.
just wouldn't happen, and it's like, that's true. In a war zone, why would you go surfing? I'm guessing that's just purely fictitious, and it would never happen in a real war zone.
It would never happen in a conflict like that. You know, it would happen in areas that weren't maybe the safest, but certainly when you're in the middle of an attack. Another quote that stuck out for me was, "The more they tried to make it just like home, the more they made everyone miss it." which I thought was quite poignant. And there was a few things that were said in the narration, to talk about the real sort of brutality of war that were good, although some of them were a bit too on the nose.
Oh, there is some very descriptive pieces of narration or dialogue. I think quotability, we've said sort of the big ones. It's not necessarily the most famously quotable one-liners, but yeah, there's a lot of good dialogue in this, and it's probably one of the good parts of the film to sort of follow, because you get a lot of backstory and sort of context from especially the narration part, which is a total must in this film. If it wasn't there, it wouldn't work either. So yeah, I think we'll now move on to not well received by contemporary critics / reviewers, if nobody else has got anything else to say on the other points.
Yeah.
So, like Ali's already prefaced, that this film is probably one of the highest rated films of all time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know that the sort of remarks I've got about it are definitely out with the norm. Now, there are one or two critics that echo what I say, but the general consensus by most of the critics that you've mentioned in previous podcasts, is it Roger Ebert?
Roger
Ebert, sorry. I mean, he loves this film. Most of the big critics absolutely love this film. So I don't think we can say it was negatively reviewed either at the time or now.
Yeah. I tried my hardest to try and find some negative reviews. I wanted to find like a real top critic that absolutely panned it, if you know what I mean, like somebody that just went, I hate this film and I'm dying on the sword. But I couldn't find any. A lot of it is positive. Did you find any negative reviews on it, Kenzie?
No, like proper ones, no.
So
like you always find like silly ones and that, but like an actual like genuine one that's like a known critic.
Yes.
So Gary Arnold, who I think's from the LA Times, he says the atmosphere of Francis Coppola's lamentable magnum opus, Apocalypse Now, a ruinously pretentious and costly allegorical epic about war in Vietnam, recalls nothing so much as the notorious campfire scene in Mel Brooks' Blazing Saddles. It is the cumulative effect generated by mixing richly pretentious imagery with absurdly pretentious prose, starkly pretentious sound, and flatulently pretentious music. Now, I think that's far too harsh, but some of what he does say rings true.
Yeah, fair. I mean, there's obviously the flip side to that is, Roger Ebert, probably the most famous film critic. 4 out of 4, he said it was the best film in 1979, and his list of top 10 films of all time in 2012 it was in his top 10 films ever. So like it's echoed that when you said it's not only one of the best war films, a lot of people have this in their top 10 films of all time. Glenn Kenny, like Roger Ebert obviously sadly passed away, but he's got a website, rogerebert.com, that film critics that put reviews up in sort of his name. He gave the Final Cut version 3.5 out of 4 in 2019 when that came out. Peter Bradshaw, writing for The Guardian, gave the film 5 out of 5. Kim Newman, who's a British film critic who does a lot of work for Empire magazine, gave the film 5 out of 5. Like I said, there are less than favourable reviews, but they seem to be few and far between. I couldn't really find any of weight when I was doing my research for the film. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film has got a 98% fresh rating. Based on 94 reviews, it's got a 94% audience score. On IMDb, it's 8.5 out of 10. It's firmly in their top 250 list, and it's really high up. It's like top 50 film, give or take. So yeah, Ali and Kenzie are wrong. That's what we've just established.
The one thing I would say to that, and some of the other films you've reviewed, which you've both really liked, and the critics have panned them, you've said, well, the critics are wrong. So we can't have it both ways. We can't have the critics being wrong at some times and right at other times.
No, it's true. No. I didn't mean that. Like, everybody's got their own opinion, and everybody's opinion is valid. I mean, that's why the podcast exists, to have people come on and talk about and give their views about things, We have people who will come in and I mean, we've had a couple who have done nothing but rave about the film that they've picked, i.e. my brother-in-law who done the Big Trouble episode, who literally was never, he was dying on his sword at all times. It's like, it's the best, one of the best films ever made, is, well, not maybe ever made, but one of my favourite films of all time, is the number one on the list. It's like, it's fair. And then we kind of have people who, Ali and many of my friends have critiqued Jordan and his weird scale of how he rated the Fight Club on the Fight Club episodes, when he gave it 5 out of 5 but put it like 85 in his top 100, which is a bit strange, but welcome to the Mindy Jordan. We'll try to get him back on, because I liked having Jordan on, but we'll try and see if we can work something out and get him back on. No, but what the reason I touched on that, no, everybody's got their own opinion. Obviously, I'm really high on this film. Used to are sort of in the middle, and you have people who might even hate this film more than yous. Not hate the film, not like this film as much as is probably the right terminology. But I wanted to just touch on when I had Nick on the Godfather episode. He's not a fan of gangster films, and he says that in the podcast. And I think if he was to give his own personal rating of the film, it would have been much lower than what he gave it. What
did he give it?
So he gave it 4 out of 5. I gave it 5 out of 5. Nick gave it 4 out of 5.
Well, I don't think I would have gave it 4 out of 5.
Well, you should have been on the podcast, but you decided to sleep in.
I know. I thought I'd
the
sleep in, but I probably. Do you know what? I don't know if you want to hear what I have to say about it.
Well, it's a different episode, mate. We're not talking about the Godfather. We're talking about Apocalypse.
Yeah,
now.
I know that. I would just say that. Yeah.
No. But Nick did preface that it was an objective viewpoint after our discussion about a lot of the sort of technical things about the film and stuff like that, and he could see why the film is lauded as one of the best films in cinema. So I think that's why he gave it such a high review. But I think an actual reflection of his own viewpoint would have been something maybe 3 or 2.5, because he's not a gangster film fan. So that's totally fair. But some people will come on here with a different attitude, and they'll be open to maybe looking at it from different angles. Where some people will come on the podcast and it'll just be they'll be strong in the mind and stick to their guns, and some people will be willing to have a conversation, and they might have come in with an initial point where they're like, no, this is what I want to give it, but over time you have a conversation that it might sway one way or the other, and that's always great to have conversations like that. So yeah, nothing really more to add on the Not Well Received by Contemporary Critics / Reviewers, but yeah, apart from it's a massively lauded film by the majority, but there is a minority of people that are less than favourable. So yeah, are we moving on to explores controversial topics, subjects and themes. Now, this is a funny one. I think there was a lot of controversy surrounding the production of this film, and there is a lot. But in terms of what the film's exploring in terms of the piece of work, is it controversial?
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
I would say so. But that's just me. But I think it's definitely.
So why do you think that?
I mean, just the war in itself is a huge,
that's a big
controversial
controversy, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, like we've said, it's
itself,
not about the Vietnam War, but I suppose.
But it's set during it.
Yeah.
It's still, and everything shown in it is super controversial. How there is no there's no one in charge of anything. No one knows what they're doing. The people who are in charge seem to be fucking about surfing. It's got a lot to say. It's not pulling its punches of what it's trying to depict. It is quite a controversial take.
I've got to say,
the war is too.
I agree with Kenzie completely on that. And I mean, if you actually look at what the plot is, you've got an American soldier / CIA agent, depending on how you want to classify him, who goes to kill another American soldier as an execute him. That
True.
just does not. That's a controversial subject. You know, that is not the kind of thing that is common in warfare.
Does it happen though? I mean, you know more about the military than we do.
What, does that happen?
Well, that's why I'm asking him.
To someone
Yeah,
of
yeah,
your
it would have, and it would have happened.
own
yeah.
service, no. You would capture them, you would try them, you would court-martial them. But at the same time, you would never happen where somebody would go as rogue as that. That just wouldn't happen.
Because they wouldn't have allowed it to get that far in the first place.
Exactly.
Surely people slip through the cracks, so surely there is people that do go rogue and...
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at
Yeah.
what's happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's loads of cases of people that have gone rogue, took the law into their own hands, and whether they've murdered prisoners or treated prisoners really badly or done a whole bunch of horrible things, and they are captured and they're court-martialed and they're tried fairly. They're not summarily executed by a member of their own forces.
But so that's the funny thing you touched on. So is Martin Sheen's character a CIA agent or is he a soldier?
It's a bit dubious. I believe he uses the rank of captain, so that would make him out to be a soldier. But I think he's potentially on secondment with other, whether it's CIA or other agencies. So I think he is definitely started as a soldier, but is potentially on secondment to another agency.
But that poses another question, is because I would assume that people that get that line of work in terms of working for CIA, FBI, those kind of undercover style operations, would be a lot maybe more sound of mind, and maybe a lot kind of, they would maybe be sort of bigger stature, I suppose. I don't know. He feels a bit like not the type of person you would associate with being a CIA agent or somebody that would go undercover, but maybe that's why he got chosen.
Potentially. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about this is, there is a real coldness about him, and in a lot of the acting that he does, and you see that come across in the boat scene where they shoot up the boat, and then at the end he pulls out his handgun and gives the killing shot, and he has a coldness in his actions. But there's that internal conflict all the way through the film, and that's brought out in the narrative. And I think that's what is the most controversial about this, is how much that you go along with orders and how much you let your own personal morality come to affect what you think is personally right or wrong. And I don't think it's ever gives a proper resolution, but neither do I think it needs to give a proper resolution, because that's the internal conflict that exists within us all.
Yeah, I just don't like. I mean, I suppose the war in Vietnam, and I suppose the way that it does depict American forces is probably deemed highly controversial, and this film probably wasn't liked by a lot of people associated with the military or with the war movement. I mean, there was a lot of protests against it. I mean, well documented. So, but for the people that protested against it, there was obviously people that were pro-war, and it's the same with all wars, I suppose. The thing that kind of baffles me more and more as a human and watching the way the world is there's a lot of media being made about situations that never needed to happen, but the world never ever learns, ever. I mean, and we live in a world where it's still war-torn. It's just maybe not as necessarily front-page news all the time, but there's always conflict going on somewhere in the world. It's maybe just not, because it's not, I think the mainstream media only attach themselves to things that are relevant or matter to them or the greater good. I mean, what's going on with Russia and Ukraine is a prime example. I mean, that's something that's a bit silly, isn't it? But from a viewpoint from me, but you like you say, you're more political and more about military than me, and I just think it's we as a race of people, we've never ever learned from the mistakes that we've made, and that's a quite a sad thing to see.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that completely, Johnny. That's a good point.
But controversy is maybe surrounded the film.
Is it? But that's what I bring up. Is it true that in the past 100 years, America's always been constantly in some sort of war? Is that not like true or something?
Yeah.
Since the Second World War, there's only, I think, been 1 year that a UK service person hasn't been killed in conflict since the Second World War. So it's not even just the US. The British have been embroiled in all sorts of different conflicts across the world as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you've got major wars which are obviously well documented, but like I said, there's loads of different conflicts going on around the world, and I mean, you've only got to look at, I mean, internal conflict in loads of countries which are run by dictatorships. They're always at war, essentially, because you've got somebody who's bleeding with an iron fist and people who don't agree with it. It's not all the world lives in democracy, unfortunately, but it's just the way it is. No, but that does strike me as true. America probably has been in some form of conflict for the last 100 years or so. I mean, it's like war after war after war. It's never ever. I mean, we're not a military podcast. We're not a political podcast, but for the most part, it doesn't ever seem like the right outcome when all's said and done and the dust settles. You only have to look at the Second Iraq War or the conflict in the Middle East in the 2000s. It was just it never ever needed to happen, but don't really want to get bogged down on that. Like I said about this film, though, not only is it sort of controversial in nature, there is a lot of controversy surrounding the actual sort of production of the film as well. I mean, I just wanted to bring up things like the animal cruelty, like the water buffalo getting slaughtered.
That water buffalo, that was real.
That was real, yeah. It wasn't.
That looked real.
It is real. Because it's a ritual performed by the local Afugo tribe, which Coppola and his wife Eleanor had witnessed. It was later shown. The thing is there's a documentary about the making of Apocalypse Now that came out in the early 90s, which I wish I'd been able to get my hands on and watch before this podcast, but I'm going to go out and try and seek it and buy it, because this film seems like the type of production that I would love to look at from the inside and see exactly what went on. I just want to touch upon this as well. Apparently real human corpses were bought from a grave robber. But
ooh,
yeah, because in the final act of the film, there's a lot of kind of dismembered bodies and stuff. It can be quite tough to watch. They were questioned by the police, and eventually the soldiers and stuff, they all took the bodies away. So they were initially planning to use them.
That's fucked.
And
like,
instead extras were posed as dead bodies in the film. But yeah, it's like I said, and like we spoke about things like Martin Sheen's heart attack and like the production kind of getting convoluted and sort of ran over time. Obviously, it must be a very, very controversial movie from the inside in terms of development and onwards. But yeah, but I think we've sort of talked about sort of the main ones. Anybody else got anything to add to this about the controversy surrounding the film?
I feel like we've mainly covered it.
Good to go.
Yeah.
So, last point that we speak about is the cultural impact and the legacy of the film. I mean, it probably did impact culture, but obviously I'm a chunk younger than obviously people that were about when this film came about and how it would feel. And me and Ken's are kind of young, and that's maybe a question to ask kind of people that were of an age at the time this film was released, because I think that they're probably going to be able to sort of have more of an input in that. But in terms of legacy, that you just have to see where people are putting this in terms of the way they view films in cinema history. The legacy of this film is spectacular, and I know that Ali's brought a couple of Vietnam War films to the table which are better than his mind, like Platoon and Full Metal Jacket, and Kenzie's a fan of Full Metal Jacket. But I honestly think that if Apocalypse Now and potentially The Deer Hunter, because The Deer Hunter came out in '78, Apocalypse Now '79. Apocalypse Now should have came out first, like we spoke about. But if those films weren't successful, do you really think other filmmakers would have ventured into the Vietnam War? Because it seems like these films might have got some backlash from sort of people, and they maybe went, do you know what, that's maybe something we shouldn't touch on. But because audiences were willing to give it a chance and go and watch it, and it was profitable, it then gave other filmmakers and other writers and producers and directors the chance to look at the Vietnam War and develop their own take and their own stories surrounding it.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that point, Johnny. I think it's a really good point. And I think in terms of its legacy and cultural impact, you just have to look at the amount of times it's been recut and re-released. You know, that obviously shows that it's got an impact on the cultural psyche. And I think personally, any time a film is referenced on Friends, as Apocalypse Now was, then it must have had some impact on the cultural zeitgeist. And if you look at all sorts of different comedy shows and sort of modern sitcoms, you know, there are references to it. And there's one particular series, I can't remember which, but that does an entire episode which is a parody of Apocalypse Now. So as much as I'm not a massive fan of the film, I think it's hard to disagree with its cultural impact and legacy.
I've actually got a video game reference that I just remembered from one of the Tomb Raider remakes. So the Tomb Raider games, they eventually made like remakes of it from like 2013 to like kind of 2017. The first, or it's more of a reboot anyway, but the first game, there's a part in it where Lara falls into like a pool of blood, and she comes out the water with just her eyes, and it's completely obviously referencing the part in Apocalypse Now when Sheen comes out after jumping into the water, he kind of comes out with the face paint on, like you just see his eyes, like, you know, that iconic kind of shot. It's like completely referencing that in like every way. So it gets references everywhere.
Far Cry 3. There was like
shit.
a thing in Far Cry 3 with the music and the helicopter. It's a helicopter attack scene. Ride of the Valkyries, obviously, it was chosen most memorable film scene by Empire, but the scene is recalled in one of the last acts of Far Cry 3. That's another video game. Talking about that scene where coming out with the eyes, it's very like people have done that in a weird way. It kind of reminds me almost a bit like Predator in a weird way as well, like the sort of hunting down. It's but yeah, I mean, it has been referencing a lot. The one thing that I think is quite funny is Hot Shots Part 2. There's obviously it's Charlie Sheen is in Hot Shots, and who is Martin Sheen's son, and there's sort of reference to that because his character's riding up a boat in Iraq while on a rescue mission, and passes Martin as Captain Willard as they go the other way. And they also went even further as the promotional material for Hot Shots Part 2 included a mockumentary which aired on HBO titled Hearts of Hot Shots Part 2, a filmmaker's apology, which is a parody to the 1991 documentary of the making of Apocalypse Now, which was called Hearts of Darkness, a filmmaker's apocalypse. So yeah, it's been referenced across the board. It's and not only that, it's like we spoke about it in terms of where it sits in people's lists. Ali won't like the fact that Roger Ebert considered it the finest film on the Vietnam War ever made, but I know that your viewpoints are very different.
You know, it's one of these things. I think if he'd maybe been in a conflict, he'd maybe have a different opinion.
Yeah, that's maybe true. So yeah, it's on loads of lists. I don't want to read them out, but yeah, the legacy and the cultural impact, like Ali said, if it's crossing over into sort of sitcoms of the 90s, and it's being parodied in sort of other films, and it's even making its way into video games, modern video games, yes. And like I did preface, that it probably opened the door for other films to sort of approach the same subject matter, obviously in a different way. And actually, funnily enough, on the list of the films, there's a couple more Vietnam War films. We've got the Deer Hunter on the list to do, and Full Metal Jacket's also on the list. So it'll be interesting when those episodes get done and we can contrast and compare and see the guests on those episodes, how they feel about those films and sort of where it sits in terms of how... Because I can categorically say that Apocalypse Now is probably going to be brought up in those podcasts as well, even if it's just touching upon it. But yeah. So yeah, massively culturally impactful, and it's got a huge legacy, the film. And yeah, I mean, having re-releases that have sort of been reissued and re-released, it sort of keeps it in the public eye. I think I said the same about Blade Runner, the fact that I had multiple releases over sort of 25 years, it kind of makes people appreciate it more, and I think that's maybe what's happened here. So if that's... Is anybody else got anything to add before we move on to the third act of the podcast?
No, I think I'm good.
Good, Ali. Right, so that is us with the rules, and we'll move on to the third act of the podcast, and that is basically based on the conversations that we've just had. Do we think that this film is a cult film? And if so, does it deserve its place on a top 100 list? So, yeah, this will be interesting. Because I've got an interesting take in my opinion on this. But I'd be interested to see where your guys' minds are as well. I kind of view this in the same light as I did Blade Runner. In the respects of how the film might have been viewed at the time versus now, over the 40-year period it's been released. I can see why it might have been a cult film initially, but I don't think I can see it as a cult film now, but I think that's maybe just my opinion. I think other people might have other opinions. I mean, how do you guys feel about it?
I agree, Johnny, with what you're saying. I think it's a classic film. You know, I think the fact that it is absolutely loved by critics and appears to be loved so much by fans. I think for something to be a cult film, it has to be a bit more divisive. There has to be more people than just me and Kenzie that don't seem to like it as much as other people. The one thing I would say is that, and this is a purely subjective anecdotal evidence, pretty much everyone I speak to who I respect in terms of what they think of films, and
not me,
and people that I know that are, shall we say, in the military business, don't like this film. Or, you know, they don't think it's as good as other people say. So as much as, you know, all the websites and everything, they tend to be driven by people who love films. And I think a lot of the general public maybe don't like this film as much. So that's the only thing that I could maybe say is a bit sort of cult filmish. But overall, I'd agree with you that it's more of a classic film as opposed to a cult film.
I mean, I just have to. I completely agree with both of you. It's just not a cult film at all. Most people will deem it as a classic. The film's too big. If you think of a war film, it's pretty much bar like maybe Saving Private Ryan. If you think of a Nam war film, it's probably the one that most people will say. It's just not a cult film. And it by most people will be deemed as a classic. So, yeah, I think that's an easy one.
Yeah, I think it's there. I think films do eventually cross a line, you know, and some stay in the cult sort of line forever. But like this, I mean, I'm aware that this film, when it came out, could have been viewed that way, do you know? But like I said, it's just one of the films that sort of paved the way for what's classed as New Hollywood. I think The Godfather was kind of one of them, so it was shifting from the sort of golden age, quote unquote, of the sort of 50s and early 60s, and it was like this sort of new breed of filmmaker was coming in and making these kind of visual spectacles and sort of approaching things differently. I mean, you've just got to look at some of the directors that made their directorial debut in the late 60s and 70s and sort of eventually rode the wave of that, and a lot of people's favourite directors of that time period's best work's probably done in that sort of time frame as well. I mean, I don't think this is Francis Ford Coppola's best film, but I know that some people might say that it is his magnum opus, and it's just people's opinion there. I think he's a good filmmaker, but he's had some misses as well. Like, he's done some spectacular films. He's also done some duds. But yeah, I kind of view this the way I did The Godfather. It's so highly revered, and it's hard to find a bad take on the film when doing research. I know that Ali said that everybody that he speaks to has said that they don't think it's as good as other people think. But even while trying to research this, I really struggled to find a really negative review that had weight, if you know what I mean, like somebody that I recognised or like is well revered in that aspect. So, and like I said, I believe this film was a classic piece of cinema and not a cult classic, at least anymore, in my opinion. So yeah, I think we all agree in that. So that's where we would probably wrap it up, because we wouldn't be placing this on a top 100 cult movies list or cult film list for any of us, because we don't think it's a cult film. I would just like to point out that this would probably make my top 100 films of all time. I know Ali's looking at me going, that's a shocking take, but it's all personal, isn't it? It's all people who've got their own opinions.
I don't think this would make my top 100 war films of all time.
Come on, like, there can't be that many.
I could even do a top 100 war films to be honest. I shouldn't be allowed to do that.
You can't. Like, I know you don't like the film, but you can't. Surely you can't think of 99 other movies that are better than this. That are war
give me an
films.
Afternoon, and I'll give you a list.
No way. Like, I know that you don't like the film, but surely it would sneak into a top 100. Because 100's a lot.
Potentially on pure artistic terms, and the way it looks, the way it sounds, and the way it feels, I could potentially sneak into that. But for me, the whole third act just destroys what was a pretty good film until it gets there, and the whole film collapses upon itself. But I'll get you that list this afternoon.
I look forward to reading it. It might spark me to go and watch some of the films on the list, I suppose, which is always good. But yeah, have we anybody else we've missed anything that anybody wants to bring up just before we wrap up the podcast, or are we good to just wrap it up there?
I'm pretty happy.
Kenzie probably wants to go back to sleep.
I'm bedtime, and I'm up. I'm up. Gonna play some Dead by Daylight or something. I don't fucking know.
Well, anyway, that is it for this episode of the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure, as always, to break down a piece of cinema that I love, but also with people who have a different viewpoint. And yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast, Ali. It's actually been really good. I've enjoyed it.
No, thanks very much for having me on. As I say, I love listening to this, and it's been an absolute honour and a pleasure to chat through with both of you. Thanks very much.
But yeah, and thanks for listening. Obviously, to other episodes, Ali. It's great to have your support. But yeah, as always, if you would like to get in touch with the podcast, you can find us on Instagram at Cult Film Cafe. Go over there, give us a follow, subscribe to our YouTube channel, all that good stuff. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, all the platforms that you can find podcasts. So go over there, whatever one you use, go over there, check us out. And as always, if you'd like to email the podcast, you can email us at thecultfilmpodcast@gmail.com. If you'd like to give me a follow on social media, personally, I am 081331 Productions on Instagram. It's the only social media that I use. And yeah, you go over there, check out some of my own productions, things that I've done. Yeah, if you're interested in that. And yeah, you can find Kenzie on Instagram at
Doge_dogs on Instagram.
And I am not plugging his Twitch stream ever again, so yeah, we're not going to do that again. No, but I will link it in the bio. But Kenzie, you've now been saying to people that you're going to be streaming on Twitch for about the last 2 months, and you've never done a Twitch stream since. So yeah, I think that's dead and buried. Maybe you should just focus on podcasting instead of Twitch streaming.
I'm always going to go back to it. I've not done it, but I am. It's going to happen. 30 years later.
So how about yourself, Ali? Anything you want to plug? Get people to listen to you. Got anything that where they can find you? I know that you've got Ali's a friend of mine, and he's got a good take on things. It's very original and sometimes very to the point, but it's good. So if there's any platform that you can check out what he's got to say.
I think after that episode, I don't think many people want to listen to what I have to say, but no, I'm not the massive fan of social media, so nothing really to plug.
No, nothing for Ali. That's fine. I've had people on here that are not social media fans, so that's fine. But yeah, Ali, pleasure as always. And so, yeah, that is it for the episode. So it's a goodbye from me.
And it's a goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Podcast out, everybody.